What are your plans for improving local infrastructure, such as roads and public transportation? And we'll go to Andrew.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. It would be very easy to run off a whole list of local infrastructure projects that I would say I'm definitely going to have those done. And the reality is that it's the 7 Lochaber councillors working together and convincing colleagues elsewhere to commit the funding that is required for those. And that's a big challenge. It's an enormous challenge. And I've seen in the past where 7 Lochaber councillors were united in wanting funding for a covered sports pitch on Blar Moor next to the high school. And we were simply outvoted by Inverness councillors. And lo and behold, we see significant sports pitch provision in the city just months after that. And I still sort of bear the scars of that debate. So it sort of goes back to our previous question about smaller areas. And quite often the council will say that it's all down to funding. That particular example had nothing to do with funding. It was when public finances were in a very different situation to where they are today. But I would like to see things like our bus services improved. It pains me to see the cutbacks to the town services that have occurred recently, and the impact that that will have on our elderly and families with younger children, all because of timetabling issues, or at least that seems to be the fundamental reason behind it. I'd like to see a regeneration of the transport hub, the station and the bus station, which is possibly one of the most unwelcoming places in Lochaber. And we had the opportunity 3 or 4 years ago to put up a levelling up fund bid for exactly that. And the Highland Council officers failed to prepare a bid, whereas they prepared a bid that was successful for levelling up fund for Inverness and the regeneration of Butt Park in the city. But above all, I would like to see a renewed effort collectively by Lochaber councillors to lobby both the UK and Westminster governments for funding for the big projects that need solving. Things like an A82 upgrade, a relief road to ease the congestion through Fort William, the Corran Ferry and the Balford Hospital. And let's hope that by the end of this particular term of office for this council, that we've made significant steps forward in each of those projects and many of the other infrastructure projects that we so desperately need to look at here in Lochaber.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. We'll go to Rebecca.
You caught me unaware. We changed order. Cool. Okay, so in the last few weeks, the independent SNP administration has actually passed a £2 billion infrastructure investment, which is planned to do an awful lot of work on roads. And it would be my role, if I was elected, if I was fortunate enough to be elected, to make sure that we got our share of that. Our long-term investment plans are routes back to prosperity. And despite the very real sense of neglect in Fort William and Ardnamurchan, it's worth remembering that actually it was £20 million diverted directly from Inverness and a plan for a flyover that has solved the Corran Ferry current crisis. Is that universally popular? No. And is it perfect and pleasing everybody? No, it isn't. And we obviously need to start looking at the next phase of the plans for Corran now that one has been agreed. But the long-term solutions take a long time and there aren't any magic bullets. So we need to maximize efficiency in the short term. Andrew's right about the buses. There needs to be sustainable public transport in good condition and on time with a timetable that makes sense. We currently have timetables that are based on 40-year-old timetables and school runs. And it needs to be that it's suiting everybody. There are new estates. So, for instance, there are 85 families in Upper Akantura and 180 families on Blar who don't have buses at all. And clearly that needs to be part of planning, but it also needs to be enforced. We need to develop a strategic view and make sure we include new options and new ways of thinking, such as perhaps splitting routes, using more frequent, smaller buses and alternative forms of public transport. We also need to remember the rural areas where private transport is actually a lifeline, and we need to make sure that those areas are having access also to services. So it's not just Fort William, it needs to be the whole ward.
That's great. Thank you, Rebecca. Susan.
That's unmuted, yeah. Yep, I am really convinced that if we're going to do things about climate change that make sense, it's got to be not just a switch to electric cars, but a switch to public transport. And I think we're incredibly fortunate in Lochaber in having a skeleton, but a solid skeleton of buses. I mean, I think it's terrible that the buses have been cut back. But at our end, you can actually get into Fort William and do a day's work and get back again. And I'd really like to see many more buses, because I think you've got to have a bus at least once an hour if you're going to get people out of the cars. The cars are so flexible that it's very, very difficult to persuade people to leave them at home. I also think we need some more train lines. I've been talking for years about putting a train link through from Roybridge through to Newton Moor, so that people can get over to that side of the country, as well as going up and down to Glasgow. And I think, although I don't think electric cars are the answer, I think they're part of the answer, and we're just throwing them down the pan at the moment because we're not getting the charging right. So people are coming up here, or people who live here are travelling around, they get to a charging point, it's bust. I've got one opposite my house, and I see these poor people standing on the phone for hours talking to people down the line. And so I'd really like to see a huge movement on public transport. I totally appreciate what Andrew says, that the difficulties of working with small budgets, and I think that we need to raise this at a national level. And I've seen the councillors going through agonies trying to prioritise a shrinking budget and make the best of it. And I think they've done that with great integrity, really, by and large. I'm sorry about Buck Park getting preference over Lochaber, but I think it's just not possible to do the job you need to do with the way that the money's allocated at the moment. And we need to have a big change nationally in order to make this happen. Thank you.
That's great, Susan. Nathan.
Okay, right. So first and foremost, I think, as sort of mentioned as well, we do need to ensure, I think, that, again, the Highlands are quite unique in this sense, and private ownership does need to be protected when it comes to things like cars. I think there is a sort of a national basis now to try to force motorists off the road in this country, I think, which is being pushed a little bit. And I think that needs to be you need to always bear that in mind when we're trying to solve these problems of whether people really want them solved or not, to be honest. I think I would probably go back to the smaller council thing. I think, again, if you want to talk about infrastructures in case of improvement in roads and repairs, smaller councils, more involved locally, that's going to help in that scenario. Like I think I touched upon it before, someone who's never driven on that road isn't going to care that you're complaining about it because it's not going to affect them. Someone who's local and lives there and drives there every day is going to take notice of that. So I think that's one thing I would say there, is if you want to improve general infrastructure, you want to improve condition of roads, things like that, it should be done on a more local level. It should be done with less red tape and bureaucracy involved, because that just siphons money away from the fixing of the actual infrastructure itself. As far as public transport, there's a lot of talk. We have, all over the Highlands, massive problems with buses, trains. They're never running. When they are running, they're at the most ridiculous times possible. You miss one bus and it's 4 hours to the next one, things like that. Personally, in my personal view, I feel that part of the issue we have is that we have we have subsidized transport. We have, contracts with councils and governments that mean that there's no competition. which means that these companies can do pretty much whatever they want. They don't really have to actually run as a business per se because they're subsidized. They have the contract. And so I feel that actually, if we want to improve buses, we want to improve public transport and ways that people are going to get about, we should encourage change. We should encourage that